Good evening and welcome to Military Images Live. This is episode 6 of season 2, coming to you live from Arlington, Virginia. My name is Ron Coddington. I'm the editor and publisher. Hey there, I see a thumbs up from Jean. And welcome, Jean. Welcome, Anne. We're going to give everyone just a minute or so to come on this evening before we get started. So I want to tell you that our latest issue is just out. Hey, Dale. Hey, Doug. Welcome to the show. Our latest issue is recently out, and you can see a copy of it right here. The lead image is a portrait of a soldier holding a portrait. Or a pip, as Doug York of Civil War Faces likes to say. The issue is out now. Subscriptions are available. We hope that if you're watching this program and you enjoy what you see here, that you'll consider subscribing. In fact, darn it, you'll go out right now and subscribe. Well, hold on a second. Wait till the show's over and then subscribe to Military Images. We have a great deal, and I'll post it on the site. So we got more folks coming on now. Michael Pissarro is here. Craig McNutt. Craig, hello. Fred, how are you doing this evening? Thank you for the thumbs up symbols and the other emojis coming up on the screen. I really appreciate it. I want to start out this evening with an announcement that I hope you'll enjoy as much as I have. Doug York and I mentioned Doug earlier from Civil War Faces. We've been talking about how can we do a better job to get out and give the community opportunities to get together. And many of the shows, as you know, are on the East Coast, as far out to Chicago, to Mansfield. Those shows, in fact, are coming up soon. But Doug and I are pleased to present the fact that Civil War Faces show and sale is coming to Kansas City. So Kansas City, here we come. We'll be in the great city between October 3rd and October 6th. We will have 19 tables dedicated to Civil War photos. And I should say a big thank you to our partners, the Daguerrean Society. They have an annual seminar, and we will be part of that. So a big thanks to the society, especially Mike Medhurst, who is the president. He's an advertiser in Military Images, and those of you who know him to be one of the finest, most reputable dealers in the business. So if you want to send up some emojis, send up some for Mike Medhurst and the Daguerrean Society. So more to come on that in the near future, I hope. So speaking of Facebook and Facebook pages, I want to talk a little bit about the Civil War and 19th century image collector. That page is run by Dale Neeson, and I've noticed that Dale is doing some pretty cool things on his page, including weeks that are dedicated to various subjects. Oh, I'm seeing a lot of hearts go up right now. So I suppose that's from some of you who follow Dale's page on Facebook. So they have these weekly themes. Right now, they're doing women for Women's History Month. And beginning in early April, they're going to be looking at soldiers from Shiloh, from the Battle of Shiloh in commemoration of the anniversary. And so Military Images, as you may know, recently published in our current issue, we have a whole gallery of, I think it's about 30 images of identified Union and Confederate soldiers who were injured, wounded, captured, or had some battle story to tell. And one of them is this gentleman pictured here. This is John Gordon Coltart of the 26th Alabama Infantry. And those of you who are familiar with his story know that he became colonel just 2 days before the fighting at Shiloh. And he got there, was engaged in all of those early actions when the Confederate forces were pushing back the Union Army. And at some point during the action, he was wounded by a shell or a bullet. And according to most accounts that I've read of the battle, they all say that Coulthard was wounded and then left the field of battle. And so I did a bit of digging around as part of the research for this project, and I was really quite interested to find some accounts of him where it says actually he was wounded in the battle. The wound occurred in his foot, I believe in his heel. And so he fell back, which is where most of the histories end. But what they don't say is he fell back, had the wound dressed, and then went back into the action. So here's a guy, he's been shot in the foot, likely a lot of blood, a lot of pain. He goes back out into the action. He realizes that got some serious problems. The Union forces are starting to come on strong. They had over 400 men going into the battle. Coulthard sees that the numbers of Alabamians are declining. He orders a withdrawal, and they finally fall back. And by the time they do fall back, there's only about 200 of his troops remaining. So Coulthard's story goes on from there. He is wounded at the Battle of Atlanta in '64 and continues on, dies soon after the war ends. So I wanted to tell you about Coulthard tonight because he's one of the stories of Shiloh that you don't hear a lot about. And as Shiloh is coming up, I would recommend looking at the gallery in Military Images. And you can also look at Dale Neeson's Civil War and 19th Century Image Collector Facebook page for more. You can also post your own images there. So check it out. Some of you may know that I was in Wisconsin weekend before last, participating in a great event in Kenosha at the Civil War Museum. And I've talked about it on a couple programs. If you have not been to the Civil War Museum in Kenosha, I highly recommend it. Great museum. Doug Dahman and the crew there do a fantastic job of bringing the Civil War history alive. So while I was there as part of a day of Civil War talks, one of the things I learned was the connection of African Americans to the Civil War, specifically the connection of Virginia to Wisconsin during the Civil War. And this is a story that I'd never heard of. It's this gentleman pictured here. Anybody recognize him? All right. His name early on in life was John Wales Hemmings. Now, the name Hemmings may ring a bell. If it doesn't, he was born in Virginia, and he wound up moving to Ohio in the 1830s. And in Ohio, he eventually changes his name to Jefferson and went by the name John Wales Jefferson. So those of you who are now putting this together can connect the names Jefferson and Hemmings. So this gentleman was of African descent, but he passed for a white soldier. And in fact, he left Ohio in 1852 when the Fugitive Slave Act was coming down hard and being prosecuted in Ohio. So Jefferson eventually goes to Wisconsin, settles in Madison, and becomes a high-ranking officer, a lieutenant colonel in the 26th Wisconsin Infantry. I'm sorry, the 8th Wisconsin Infantry, my fault. And he's lieutenant colonel, and he fights a number of significant battles and goes on. He survives the war. One anecdote I find that you may find interesting comes from 1902, when a neighbor recalled Jefferson's concerns about his mixed ancestry in the social climate of the times. And this neighbor says, I saw and talked with one of his sons during the Civil War, who was then wearing the silver leaves of a lieutenant colonel. That's John Wales Jefferson, and in command of a fine regiment of white men from northwestern state. Here's where it gets interesting. He begged me not to tell the fact that he had colored blood in his veins, which he said was not suspected by any of his command. And of course, I did not betray a secret. So one of the many things that I learned while I was in Kenosha, Wisconsin at the Civil War Museum, an interesting connection to Wisconsin. There's a lot more, so I recommend that you go visit the Civil War Museum in Kenosha to learn more. Now, take a look at this photo. If you can see the damage, the entire center of this photograph appears to have been creased. It is a tintype. You can see by the rust on the edges of the iron plate, and some very, very bad creasing, which has literally obliterated the entire soldier. You can see little portions of his face here, but there's not much to go on. This image was submitted by Cliff Catania, who's the owner of Joshua's Attic. They've been a subscriber of Military Images and an advertiser for a long time. And Cliff sends me an email, and he points out a dilemma. And here's the dilemma. And this is where I need your help. He says, restore or leave damaged. These are hard on the eye to see these damaged photographs. Where is the tipping point to actually do something? So what Cliff is suggesting is, when do you take action? Do you just leave this image as it is, or do you try to repair it? He says, if you're a purist, what do you do? Is there ever a time to restore an image like this? So Cliff goes on to say, these are aesthetic questions, individual preferences, but very philosophical issues to both collectors and historians in very, very different ways. So Cliff adds this last sentence, which is where I'm interested to get your opinions. He says, I'm curious about the feelings of you and the Civil War photography collecting community. Then he says, do you dare open this can of worms, a can of worms? So Cliff, the answer is yes, I dare open this can of worms, and I'm sharing with everyone tonight. This is a tough subject. Where do you step in as a restorer? When do you attempt to bring an image back that has been damaged, especially one on this level? So I'm putting it to you. If you all want to leave comments on this Facebook page, I welcome it. I'm curious to know, how do you feel about restoring? How do you feel about fixing all the chips, the dents, the scratches, this other information on here? If you don't feel comfortable leaving a comment, email me. That's militaryimages@gmail.com. I feel pretty strongly about this issue. I think folks have a lot to say about it. So what I'm hoping to do is find out what all of you have to say, and then put something together that sort of summarizes that and put it back at you. I think there's some good conclusions here to draw from a question that I'm sure all of us have thought about at one time or another. So leave a comment or email me, again, at militaryimages@gmail.com. Next up, you may have seen this story. It ran recently in the Washington Post. It says, her image had been buried near a Civil War battlefield for 100 years. Then I found her. That's quite a headline. And it's really an interesting story. It's written by Kevin Ambrose, who was out relic hunting a long time ago, back in 1992. And he was hunting in an area around Centerville, Virginia, which, as he points out, is in the vicinity of the Battle of Second Bull Run and other battlefields, all in that northern Virginia, Manassas area, which, by the way, is basically a bedroom community to Washington, D.C. So it's heavily, there's a lot of housing and all that's taken over. So Kevin is talking about his relic hunting, and he says, talks about what he found. And what he found is this image, which is a metal plate, which is a negative image of a woman. And he also took it into Photoshop and made a positive of the negative, so you could see the woman's, get a good look at this woman. She appears to be from the Civil War period, and the plate itself is interesting. The plate is a copy that was made of the original photograph, and then it was made in such a way using a technique called halftone, which became popular in the 1880s, was really developed in the 1870s. And the introduction of halftone was a bunch of tiny little dots that when printed would reproduce a photo. So this technique made it possible, really for the first time, to produce photographs in books and magazines. Prior to that time, in the 1860s and the early 1870s, and way before that, the technique that they used to reproduce images was by engravings. So those of you who know Harper's Weekly magazine, you know Leslie's Weekly, New York Illustrated News, the Southern Illustrated News, all these publications include engravings. This one is different because it's a halftone. So it was reproduced at least in the 1880s, maybe later than that. So Kevin finds this image, and he doesn't really talk about it for many years, and finally writes about it and it appears in the Washington Post. Kevin continues to do some poking around. He and I were in contact. He called me about this story before it was published, and I gave him some thoughts about what I thought this halftone plate really was all about. After the story was published, he continued to do some poking around. So what he found was a painting of a younger woman, certainly younger, somewhat younger than the woman in this halftone plate, but the similarity was remarkable. And so I recommended, I said, hey, Kevin, what you might want to do is take both images and upload them to Civil War Photo Sleuth and see what you can find out between the face recognition technology that drives it and, of course, the community. So what he did is he uploaded them, and guess what? They both came up as results. So Kevin's hunch that these two women might be the same, it's not an airtight identification, but the face recognition software does tell us that there was some sort of a resemblance to deliver a result. So now, those of you who are looking closely can see the name of the woman. And here's where it gets interesting. The woman's name is Virginia Beverly Huey. Now, if you know Civil War history, you may know her husband. Her husband was Wilmer McLean. Wilmer McLean is well known for his house, that house at Appomattox where Lee surrendered to Grant. You may also know that the McLeans moved to Appomattox from Northern Virginia after being caught up in the First Battle of Manassas. So Kevin's current theory is that this image, the one he has, the negative he has, is possibly Wilmer McLean's wife. So stay tuned, more to come on that photo sleuthing. Now, going to move to this man. Who knows him? Recognize him? All right, he is Gordon Granger. And the reason that I wanted to showcase him tonight is I came across him recently while researching some other Union soldiers. And I was really quite interested when I began to read about Gordon Granger's life. And you know how it is if you're a researcher, you start to go down some of these paths and it gets interesting and you can't get out. And so that's where I was with Gordon Granger. For those of you who do not know, he fought in the Mexican War. And one of the quotes about him, and now we're going to go back here to 1846, 1847. One of the quotes about him is, he did not fight for brevets or for glory. He went into a battle for the pure love of the thing. The same writer added, he was of the stuff that real soldiers are made of. So there it is, young Gordon Granger. Also says, from Veracruz to the city of Mexico, Granger was in every battle, always distinguishing himself by his perfect coolness and indomitable courage. These qualities made him admired by the men of the regiment, who went cheerfully where he would lead, and his desire to always be at the front led him occasionally into the grave error of leaving his own company when it did not happen to be in advance, which is a way of saying is Gordon got way too far ahead of his troopers. So Granger, as you know, goes on to the Civil War and distinguishes himself again. And I was really interested to find that this gentleman in uniform, you may know him. He's Charles Graham Halpine. He's on the left here. And he was a Union colonel. He was also a writer. He wrote under the pseudonym of Miles O'Reilly. So if you know of the Miles O'Reilly, the Irish private and all of his doings, it comes from the mind and the pen of this man, Charles Graham Halpine. He's pictured here, by the way, with one of his publishers, Benjamin Pellhallow Shillabar. So what I want to share with you tonight is a poem that was written by Halpine about Gordon Granger. And the reason that it caught my attention was because it sort of speaks to the fact that Gordon Granger, as a young man, really distinguished himself. He made an impression as a leader, as a very, very young man. And here he is 15 to 20 years later in the Civil War, and that same spirit of military ardor, the same sense of leadership that he had way back in the Mexican War is still present in the Civil War. He still had that bit of magic. So here's Halpine's poem, which touches on some familiar common themes. And the poem is titled, Hurrah for Gordon Granger. So here we go. Come, boys, a toast, our pride and boast, to friends a joy, to fear a stranger. Brim every glass and let it pass, the health of Gordon Granger. His manly grace of form and face made women bless our stalwart ranger. Her sparkling eyes, her tenderest sighs, were all for Gordon Granger. Each rebel lass to see him pass, to loyalty the sight would change her. For union she would henceforth be with winsome Gordon Granger. We turned to hear his voice of cheer on many a field of death and danger. The rebel foe soon came to know our yells for Gordon Granger. No finer clay for feast or fray, since the babe divine lay in the manger, has blessed the earth, then had its birth with General Gordon Granger. So here's his health, long life and wealth, and years of peace exempt from danger. Forevermore, so praise his core, be round our Gordon Granger. So there's a homage to Gordon Granger by Charles Halpine. One more poem. I seem to be finding a lot of poems this week. This other poem is about this man. You know him, Matthew B. Brady, the famous photographer. This one comes from the January 1851 issue of the Photographic Art Journal, and it is called Stanzas Suggested by a Visit to Brady's Portrait Gallery. As you know, the New York Photo Gallery of Brady was amazing. It was a salon. You went in, you were dying, you were entertained. Brady himself will come out and talk to you. You'd look at the gallery of distinguished Americans photographed, this first generation of photographers, the first generations of Americans to see photographers. You would go to Brady's gallery and just be awestruck and wowed by what you saw. And this one gentleman, his name is Caleb Lyon, had this poem. I'm only going to read you one stanza. I think it's probably the best of the entire poem. And here it goes. Like a spirit land of shadows, they in silence on me gaze, and I feel my heart is beating with the pulse of other days. And I ask, what great magician conjured forms like these afar? Echo answers, 'tis the sunshine by its alchemist Daguerre. There you go. 19th century poetry on the great Matthew Brady. All right, one more for you for this evening. You may have seen this. It was published as The Last Shot in the current issue of Military Images. For those of you who don't subscribe, it's the last page, and we always have some interesting standalone image and a bit of a history about it. This one is one of the more interesting images, Civil War portraits I've ever seen. It's basically an officer who's thumbing his nose, and it's a tintype. And we did a little bit of research to find out a bit more, and we included a couple of anecdotes about nose thumbing during the Civil War. We also traced its origins to 1840, 1841. Long before Oxford Dictionary, they say the term thumbing your nose dates to about 1850 or 1851. I'm getting a lot of emojis here, so I'm assuming you all are really appreciating this one. So this unidentified Union officer thumbing his nose caught the attention of John Brayton, who's one of our subscribers, and John has done a heck of a job on researching this. So I've got to read you a couple of the anecdotes he sent to me. So I want you to take your mind back, go back to the Civil War with me, and let's think about some of these antics that were going on both sides during the war related to this. So here we go. Here's one of them. If North Carolina were to secede from the Confederacy, Governor Zebulon Vance asserted that Abe Lincoln, quote, would put his thumb up to his nose and make certain gyrations and evolutions with his fingers. That comes from the Raleigh Semi-Weekly Standard. And here's another one from the Holmes County Farmer in Millersburg, Ohio. After winning election to corporal, a soldier grinned at me with his thumb on his nose and fingers wiggling. There's more. Actually, I have a bunch more. I don't have time to read them all. Here's one from the Western Democrat in Charlotte, North Carolina. It says, when the Yankees sent a kite across the line with Lincoln's proclamation to give amnesty to rebels who lay down their arms, they responded, quote, by a gyration of the thumb on the nose with the digits manipulating rapidly, end quote. Two more for you. This one comes from the Dayton, Ohio Daily Empire. It says, a newspaper writer imagines that when criticized for intervening in Mexico, Louis Napoleon, quote, puts his thumb on his nose at the same time wriggling his fingers and bobbing his left eye. Now, I'm sort of saving the best for last. And again, this comes from John Brayton. He found this photo in the Library of Congress collection. So it's a pretty standard, in some ways, a pretty standard scene. You've got an outdoor view. You have a cabin of some kind. You've got a bunch of soldiers out front. And those of you guys who know these images, the guys are always, they're sitting around. They might have a newspaper. They might have a cigar, a pipe. They may be cleaning their equipment, their accoutrements. They may be playing cards. They may be gathered around their tinware. And this one has a little bit of all this going on. But it also has down here in this corner quite an interesting little tale to tell. And here it is. Look at that. Here is a guy thumbing his nose at the back of the officer standing in front of him. So how's that for, in fact, a super last shot? So that's all I've got tonight. I want to thank all of you for tuning in. I really appreciate you paying attention. I appreciate your support. Again, happy hunting. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time on Military Images Live. Take care.